the States, it's good evening, so it's getting. You think you can reduce oxidation. I'm here to prove some people totally wrong. We cannot reduce oxidation. You might think that it's a bright idea to try to reduce oxidation, but we cannot. Prevention will, however, and hopefully this is what I'm going to be able to share with you a few things. I'm sorry, I'm just going to move something here. Very good. So let's start with maybe the obvious for a lot of people, but still a good point to bring over at the beginning of this presentation is flavor stability, or I call it flavor instability of beer. We know that beer is a very unstable product. As soon as you have finished producing it, you can be guaranteed that it will eventually deteriorate. And for most of the styles, the deterioration is actually brings you some negative impact on the overall flavor profile of your beers. We also know that the changes are very dynamic in the sense that some flavor notes will increase dramatically at the beginning and then maybe plateaued and even maybe decrease later on, like ribes or caddy flavors, if you will. And some others will do exactly the opposite, will totally decrease to almost inexistent. And here I'm talking about maybe like hop aroma, for instance. It's not linear as well, in the sense that flavor changes or flavor instability doesn't occur in the first 4 weeks or even in the first 4 months. It will occur and continues, as we will explain later, for as long as it goes. Um, when we're also talking about flavor instability, one very difficult point to make is what is the impact of a particular compound? Because this compound by itself might be insignificant when it comes down to the flavor profile of your beer, but in combination, you might end up having a synergistic effect with other compounds, and then you end up with something that now is detectable and undesirable. Uh, Dalglish, back in 1977, kind of make this nice representation that brings all the main component of an overall flavor profile. It's not something that is applicable to all styles of beers, but most of them. And why is that? It's because, of course, you have variability in terms of raw materials. So maybe more polyphenols, maybe more hops, maybe more proteins, et cetera, but also in terms of how you have actually produced your beers. I'm thinking about different mash mixer temperature profile. I'm thinking about maybe using decoction method instead of infusion, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of variability, but there's certainly a few things that we can point out. One is when you look at the fresh hop aroma. I don't know if can I point. I'm not sure if you see my pointer, but you have fresh hop aroma that obviously decreased. The same for the bitter taste. However, the bitter taste might be just a question of being masked by the sweet aroma that increase over time, combined with a kind of a caramelly, toffee, sugary flavor and aroma that combines and is associated with that decrease of bitter taste. I mentioned earlier ribes. It might be a term that you're not fully aware of, or that you are not very common with, but ribes is refers to black currant aroma. Some people even describe it as caddy aroma. And interesting enough, it has been demonstrated that it increased dramatically at the beginning of aging over time, and uh, then decrease later on. And then, of course, you have the papery, wet cardboard aroma and taste that will increase over time due to major oxidation. So, talking about oxidation, uh, let's just mention one more point about flavor profile or flavor instability or flavor change over time is that it's also due to the development of new compounds. And some of those compounds are the carbonyls. So you see that on that screen. Carbonyls is a carbon with a double bond of oxygen with two different radical. They are long unsaturated, very volatile compounds. So when we say volatiles, of course, it is something that tremendously can affect the aroma of your beer. Now, all carbonyls are not bad. In carbonyls, for instance, you have esters. So if we replace that on the right-hand side, that radical prime, if we replace that with an oxygen and a radical second, it's an ester. And we know that esters normally gives you a pleasant aroma and taste. If you replace that radical prime with an OH, it's going to be a carboxyl. So it is an acid. Think about acetic acid, for instance. If we replace that radical prime with a carbon, it's a ketone. And now you can think about vicinal diketones, VDKs, like diacetyl, for instance. And then finally, what is mostly of interest in our talk today is the aldehydes. And the aldehydes, you simply replace the radical prime with an hydrogen, and it gives you some aldehydes. The aldehydes are the most important driver of stale flavors. And why they're so important is because they have a very low threshold. We're talking about less than 1 ppb, 1 parts per billion, or 1 microgram per liter. So very, very low. When it comes down to aldehydes, they can be formed in different fashion, but most of the time, oxygen is the culprit. Oxygen is involved in the formation of those aldehyde. One that is well known, that is even used as the reference compound for describing oxidation, and the compound that is actually used in sensory training is trans-2-nonenal, or T2N. And you see it, it's a long chain, unsaturated, with a what is red is your oxygen with a double bond and a carbon at the end with a nitrogen white at the end. Its flavor threshold is also very low, 50 to 100 ppb, or 100 milligrams per liter. So trans-2-nonenal is the ultimate culprit of stale flavors, as a reference, I should say. Okay. So when we're talking about oxidation, let's try to visualize that a little bit, because I think that in my mind, if we have a good understanding of what oxidation is all about, then it would make a lot of sense on the steps that we're going to take later on to try to prevent. You will understand, hopefully, at the end of this presentation, that you cannot reduce it. Once it's there, and you are, excuse my French, you're basically screwed. Okay. So oxidation is always paired with another reaction called reduction. So that's why we call that the redox reduction, which simply describe, and I'm oversimplifying it, but it simply describes the transfer or the exchange of electrons. So oxidation is the process by which a compound will lose electron, whereas reduction, so the associated reduction, is the process by which another compound is actually gaining some electron. So I have here on the slide, on the first bullet point, I have oil rig. Oil rig is simply a mnemotechnic trick to remember that. So oil oxidation is losing, whereas reduction is gaining electrons. When we push the idea of oxidation, we know that oxygen doesn't have to be always involved in a redox reaction, but we're going to limit ourselves to this part because it's mostly what we are interested in. A classic example of oxidation is obviously the formation of rust. So iron in the presence of oxygen and water will react with the oxygen, will actually lose electron and become oxidized, whereas the oxygen will at this point gain the electrons and become reduced. So the oxygen is a very potent oxidizing agent. So oxygen is the oxidizing agent, and the iron in this example is the reducing agent. Why we're talking about all this is because we need to introduce what we call the oxygen carrier chain, and that's probably the meat of this lecture, is the understanding of where that comes from. So when we're talking about oxidative damage, the mechanism is actually fairly complex, and it's not a one step. It's not a one step reaction. It's a long chain. So let's say on the left hand side in the circle, you have a compound A with a small r, very small, but it's a little r. So it's in its reduced state. Now it uptakes some oxygen. So there's some oxygen in the environment and it uptakes it and it becomes oxidized. Now that compound A might not create any detectable flavor defect, but now it becomes capable of transferring those electron or that oxygen, and now you have a compound B that is now oxidized. Well, maybe again, this compound B is not detectable, doesn't seem to do anything to your beer or to tasting or this sensory evaluation of your product at this point. But again, it's just showcased that it allows the electrons to move from one compound to the other, to the point where at the end of the chain, you finally end up oxidizing a product or a compound, I should say, that is now damaging your flavor. So it's all about a chain that occurs, that exchange, that transferred those electrons from one compound to the other to finally reach the point where the flavor is being damaged by something like an aldehyde, trans 2-nonenal, to give you those very specific characteristics. So any reduced compounds is potentially an oxidizing agent. Now, oxidation cannot be reversed. The damage that is caused by oxidation cannot be reversed. The chain will continue. And I like to give this analogy that the oxygen carrier chain is like, call it a weird bank account, okay? In the sense that this bank account, you can only make deposits. You cannot make any withdrawals. So every little things that you do that favors this oxygen carrier chain will be cumulative, and you're just adding on to it and you cannot pull it out. That's why I'm saying you cannot reduce oxidation. You can reduce the potential of oxidation, but not the oxidation itself. So now what can we do? Well, I call it process control to prevent oxidation, or PC2PO. Let's start with the raw material. Raw material, to a certain extent, we don't have that much leverage, if you will, but still it's interesting to mention that on the malt side of things, we know that there's an enzyme called lipoxidase, uh, lipoxidase, yes, and or LOX, 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 that is in the malt, and it uh, favor the oxidation of lipids and giving us some stale flavors down the road that stays in either the wort or the beer, and it's obviously not desirable. We know that the maltsters are working very hard at trying to find the perfect condition of steeping and germinating and kilning to minimize the lipooxygenase enzyme, but at the same time giving you a well-modified malt. Where we have a little bit more control is how we develop our recipes. And if you're using more adjuncts, I'm talking about sugars, corn, rice, etc., you're actually might be in a better position because you have less amino acid content, for instance, that could lead eventually to the aldehydes and the stale flavors. That's what it means is that if you have less precursor to those final stale flavors or stale compounds, then obviously you're kind of indirectly protecting yourself or protecting the product. That said, we know that a low amino acid content grist or recipe can cause some other problems. We're talking about yeast nutrition. We're talking about foam stability, just to name a few. If we move on to the brew house, so um, a lot of the compounds that are in your raw material can be oxidized. We're talking about polyphenols. We mentioned fatty acids and lipids, and also some sulfhydryl containing proteins. I'm thinking about cysteine, for instance, methionine. All those can potentially oxidize at one point or another. So when we're thinking about this, is that you want to minimize the exposure to oxygen or to air. So one good practice is actually to not mill too early. I've heard often, a brewer saying, "Oh well, I have a couple of hours left on Friday afternoon before I leave. You know what? I'm going to mill for the first brew of next Monday or next Tuesday." It is not a good practice. It is absolutely not a good practice because now what you're simply doing, you're making the exposure area to air even greater, and you are starting that oxygen carrier chain, and that's the point. So do not mill too early. If you have to deal with pre-grist malt, make sure that take all the precaution to minimize the exposure to air, and keep your bags in a cooler environment too. Slow down. Temperature is obviously a big factor in oxidation. Lower the temperature, slower the chemical reaction. Is as simple as that. Okay. If we continue, well, we know that after milling, you start introducing water and heat. Some people would say, yeah, well, with heat, oxygen solubility decreased tremendously. You are absolutely correct. It decreased by a factor of about 75%. However, the oxygen that end up being dissolved is now in a warmer environment at higher temperatures, so therefore the reaction rate is greater. So you try to minimize that even on the hot side, and that's why we often refer to hot side aeration or hot side oxygenation that needs to be absolutely prevented because, again, you are just starting that chain. So I keep on going back to that chain because that's the important point. If you would be able to stay at the beginning, might not cause any problem, but those new reduced compounds will keep on exchanging their electrons and reach a point where you end up with stale compounds. So what can we do? Well, we need to do everything to prevent any oxygen exposure or oxygen uptake. Here I'm thinking about when you are transferring into the mash mixer or transferring from the mash mixer to the Lottaton, be as gentle as possible. Make sure that you have the right pump to do so. Make sure that you have a bottom entry operation to try to minimize the splashing in your vessel. All that splashing is simply helping to ingress that oxygen, that air into your mash. When you're in your mash mixer, very important to have a low shear agitation. We know that you need a good mixing to make sure that you have a uniform temperature, et cetera, et cetera. But you need to also make sure that you spin your agitator so fast that you create a vortex in the middle that will simply suck in all the air in the environment and then oxidize some of your compounds. I've seen and I've experienced that a steering velocity of less than 30 RPM is fairly ideal. I write shorter proteolytic rest. Well, the point is that nowadays the malt that we're using are fairly well modified, and therefore the protein rest per se at 50 degrees C, 122 degrees Fahrenheit is not that important anymore. It is important for rehydration, proper rehydration, and that's why I always do a very, very short, I come in at that temperature and I mix for 5 minutes top, just to make sure that, I have a good rehydration so that everything is in contact with water. I don't create any dough balls, when you come in with your malt too fast and it creates those balls that are not breaking. So I make sure that my protein rest is simply for rehydration purposes, and then I move on. Um, when you are in the Lottaton, we know that you need to not expose the grain bed to oxygen, so you always keep, 2.5 centimeter or 1 inch, of water on top of your bed. Not only it prevents exposure to oxygen, but also prevents some procedures or operational problems like what we call channeling. It's when your bed starts to crack because it starts to be dry and it creates channels. So the water that you're adding, instead of being dispersed properly, will find it's the easiest way to go through the bed, and then you're not extracting everything that you could if you would have those channels. And clear wort, well, clear wort means that you have lesser amount of fatty acids and lipids that goes into your wort. And again, the idea of less precursor to staling, the better in a better position you can be. Hope everybody is still with me. Nobody fall asleep yet. So now, if we go into thank you, thank you, thank you. If we go into fermentation and maturation, we know that during fermentation, you have some uh, naturally produced antioxidant or um, that are naturally produced by the yeast. I'm thinking about sulfite, for instance, okay, or SO2s. So SO2 is that burnt match compound that you can detect. Its flavor threshold is relatively low, around 20 ppm, but it's not really the problem. not the problem, but the issue. The natural production of sulfite is actually can reduce the rate of oxidation because SO2 reacts very quickly with molecular oxygen. So it caused a reduction in the rate of oxidation. The other beauty is that SO2 does combine with those aldehydes that we talked about and form what we call an adduct compound that is much less flavor active. So that's two ways that SO2 helps us. It's help us by mopping up the oxygen, okay, but also creating those adducts that are less flavor active. So basically, it binds those aldehydes that are responsible to that stale flavor and can just hold them like this. Okay. Um, Production of SO2 is highly dependent on strain, on your yeast strain. We know that lager produces a little bit more than ales, for instance, or via the synthesis of certain sulfur-containing amino acid like cysteine and methionine, and that's from the sulfate that is found in the wort. There's many factors that affect the production of SO2 aside from the yeast strain. You're talking about the aeration, the pressure, the amount of true, the aeration, the wort pH, the fermentation temperature, etc. All those things can obviously uh, affect or have an impact on the natural formation of SO2. Um, we are also what's interesting is that if you have a lot of so SO2 is always a kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that I explain how it can help, but also the problem is that it can also, because it reacts so well with oxygen, it can actually down the road re-release those aldehydes that now becomes available to be oxidized and then create some stale flavors. So it's a little bit an overarching message is that we can do certain things, but if after that you have other ingress, then you're basically destroying all the work that you have done. So again, in fermentation, I have SO2, I produce some SO2, the SO2 binds with my aldehyde, I kind of protect myself, wonderful. But then if later on you end up with uh, not checking your pumps or having a tremendous amount of oxygen ingress during a transfer, well, you're breaking that down and you're back to zero. So, it's not a cure. It's not a cure. It's just kind of help to control a little bit better the outcome of oxidation. Um, yes, eliminate yeast nutritional deficiencies. If your yeast works well, then of course you can be in a better position because your yeast is also obviously a yeast scavenger. Sorry, an oxygen scavenger, and try to avoid elevated fermentation temperature. So basically, we're saying in fermentation, you have to if you don't have the choice of your yeast, I mean, your yeast is the one that you're using, so you don't want to change it. So it produces the SO2 that it produces, but then you can make sure that you keep your yeast healthy. So it's all about yeast management and fermentation management in terms of temperature and pH, and et cetera, et cetera. Finally, in maturation, well, we know that if you have some active yeast, the yeast will mop up some oxygen that could have ingressed during a transfer. So it's very good to have. In finishing and in packaging, well, a lot of people focus entirely on this section, and hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll clearly understand that your work or your war your battle against oxidation starts way, way, way from the beginning. But in finishing and in packaging, there's no more yeast. Theoretically, there's no more yeast that is present to mop up a little bit of the air ingress. So you have to absolutely do everything you can to minimize any air ingress through transfer, through bottling, kegging, canning, whatever. Uh, of course, avoid warm condition storage. And again, here's just a question of temperature. Higher the temperature, faster the rate of reaction. So therefore, your longevity or your flavor stability is shortened tremendously. Also prevent the occurrence of some metal ions like copper and iron, for instance, that can become oxidizing agent, like we mentioned about with the example of rust, where iron was giving its electron to oxygen in the presence of water to form iron oxide. Okay, so you need to look at your equipment, make sure you're using stainless steel, and making sure that if you're using filtration powder, for instance, that the limit of iron content is very, very low. Um, One thing that people might not fully see the implication is about the purity of your carbon dioxide. Your carbon dioxide needs to be at 99.99% pure. So 99.9 is not sufficient. 99.95 is not sufficient because in 99.95%, the residual 0.05% is mostly air or oxygen. And assuming that this 0.05% is totally absorbed in your beer when you are force carbonating, you can increase the dissolved oxygen to up to 200 ppb. And we know that these days, to ensure longevity, especially for beers that are lighter beers, a lager, pills, et cetera, you try to extend this longevity. And if you don't have pure carbon dioxide, well, then you're losing the battle to start with. If you are pasteurizing, same idea about temperature, shorter time, lower temperature, that still allows you to pasteurize, but it's about speeding up the reaction of oxidation. So all this being said, one can also use what I would call external antioxidant agents that will act as either interrupt the oxygen carrier change or retard it or slow it down. And we're going to be briefly talking about those following: sulfite, ascorbic acid, tannic acid, and of course bottle conditioning. That, again, if you have some live yeast in your beer, it can help tremendously. So if we look at sulfite, so the same way that we mentioned that sulfite is being naturally produced during fermentation, and you can, as I mentioned, you can affect the amount that is produced with some again, double-edged sword. So, it can be, if you have too much, it can be negative as well. A brewer can add sulfite either very early in the process to try to prevent some early oxidation reaction, or later directly in the beer or in packaging to try to mop up, some air ingress at that point. Sulfite obviously creates some reducing conditions because it reacts very quickly with free oxygen and therefore gives you some protection. The What is mainly used is sodium metabisulfite, and the bisulfite is our a great reducing, a great or produce reducing conditions. We also mentioned that SO2, the same thing as naturally produced, will form also those adducts that binds those aldehydes that would otherwise get oxidized and gives you those stale flavors. Uh, the disadvantage is that the same way that SO2 or bisulfite react readily with oxygen. However, this reaction rate is tremendously decreased when you start adding alcohol. So your beer at that point contains alcohol, so the reaction with oxygen is actually decreased. We saw also that if you have live yeast in your environment, and if you have SO2s or bisulfite, it can actually, the yeast using an enzyme sulfite reductase can actually convert your SO2 into H2S. And H2S is that rotten egg flavor and aroma that is absolutely not desirable in your beer. So that's a little bit of a drawback. You can use it, but there's some negative. There could be some negative impact to it. There's also finally that even if we know that the consumption of sulfite due to beer is very, very low, we know that sulfite is cause some issue to certain individuals with asthma. And so therefore, in many countries, the limit is 10 ppm. Otherwise, you need to declare it on your labels. Another antioxidant would be ascorbic acid, or the less expensive product that is being used is sodium erythorbate. Um, I just want to make a little sidebar here to just mention that those antioxidant agent basically works in three ways. Okay, it scavenge or mop up oxygen, okay, molecular oxygen. It's either that it chelate or binds with um, oxidizing metal ions like copper and iron, and also forms adducts, forms those compounds that are less flavor active. So when it comes down with ascorbic acid, or like I said, the less expensive form, is that it slows down the reaction, it slows down the oxidation of several compounds, including phenolic compounds, amino acid, fatty acid, but also help against the degradation of isohumulones, for instance. It reacts very, very quickly with molecular oxygen, and it has been found that in combination with sulfite, limited success, but when combined on top of that with tannic acid, so a combination of sodium metabisulfite, ascorbic acid, and tannic acid. Gives you something that is very potent, very good, and there's some commercial examples of that out there, where the tannic acid basically takes care of inhibiting the LOX, the lipooxygenase enzyme activity early in the process, and the ascorbic acid um, and the bisulfite, sodium metabisulfite, basically mop up the oxygen. The disadvantage of using ascorbic acid is that eventually, over time, it will also oxidize, and its oxidized form is a potent oxygen carrier. So it becomes itself a pro-oxidant and then can cause that chain and then finally affect your product that gives you stale compounds. There might be also some potential labeling concerns when using ascorbic acid. Well, in summary, we basically uh, kind of review that beer is an unstable product. only in a few example where it is good to let your beer age. Beer is meant to be drank fresh, and so therefore we know that beer flavor will change, and it's not if it will change, it's when and by how much, and that's what we're trying to control or prevent or retard. We also saw that it's very dynamic. Some flavor notes will increase, some will decrease, some will re-increase very quickly, and then slows down, and vice versa. So it's not linear, and it's a very complex relationship because one compound by itself might not be detectable, but when it starts to be combined with others, it becomes a nightmare. And we've seen that the major culprit in all that is oxygen ingress, and so therefore we have to do everything we can to minimize any uptake, and that the antioxidant addition is absolutely not a cure. Again, remembering what I said is that the bisulfite can itself get oxidized, and so on and so forth, as well as the ascorbic acid. So it retards. It's good for a while, but eventually it will oxidize itself and then cause some issues. So antioxidant addition is not a cure. It's not a magic wand. It's not the magic powder that you're going to add at the end of your process and say, oh, well, now I'm protected. By now, I think that you understand that you start from the beginning. Um, I have two slides here. I won't go over them, but I think that it's just a nice list of critical points for you to help you out to start working towards minimizing air ingress in any way you can. So we have a list on the hot side up to the wort cooler, and we have a list on the cold side up to the bright beer tank. And again, it's just to give you some ideas of where you can start looking into your process to minimize air ingress. I want to finish by telling you that the control is across the process. It starts at the beginning. You cannot revert back. You have to start. You have to be diligent against oxidation from the get-go. Oxidation is a reaction that occurs very quickly with a tremendous amount of different compounds, and it's an effect that is cumulative. Okay, so that weird bank account where you can only put some money in and you cannot withdraw anything. This is it. It is cumulative. Every little thing that you do or don't do properly from the get-go, from milling through packaging, will be cumulative and will shorten the life of your beer, the stability, the longevity of your beer. And then finally, the hot side aeration or oxidation is not a myth. It exists, and it does cause some issues because it initiates the oxygen carrier change. So on that note, I thank you very much for listening. I hope I was able to share a few pointers with you. And if there's any questions, please by all means, I'll give it a try. Thank you very much.